People always tell you to bury your past. I did. I buried the man I used to be, 6 feet under. But the moment I saw my son in that hospital bed, his jaw wired shut with steel, I realized you can't bury the past. You're just loaning it to the devil. And that night, the devil came to collect. Stay with me, and I'll tell you the price you have to pay to buy back your son's life from a system that thinks it's worthless. You know, the worst moments of your life, they never announce themselves. They don't arrive in a clap of thunder or under a dark and stormy sky. They just slip in, quiet and uninvited, on a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon you've had 1,000 times. The kind you'll spend the rest of your life trying and failing to get back to. For me, that afternoon was a Tuesday in late October, and it started like most of my days with the simple feeling of honest work, the silence before the storm. The sun was hot on the back of my neck. I remember that. I was on a job site in Oakley County, just outside Meridian, laying concrete for a new subdivision. My hands were caked in gray dust. My knees ached from kneeling on rebar all day. For 20 years, this had been my life. Hard labor. The kind of work that leaves you sore and bone-tired, but with a clean conscience. I had chosen this life. I had built it, brick by brick, one bag of concrete at a time. I buried the man I used to be under years of sweat and discipline. All of it, every single aching muscle, every long day under the Georgia sun, it was all for him. For Caleb, my son. He was 17, a good kid, a great kid. He had my height but his mother's smile. He was smart, respectful. He had a jump shot that was pure poetry. A full basketball scholarship to a Division I school was waiting for him. His ticket out, his chance to be something more than his old man. He was my redemption. He was the living, breathing proof that a man could break the cycle, that the sins of the father did not have to be the sins of the son. As I was packing up my tools that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him, just a picture of his new sneakers, the ones I'd worked a double shift to buy for him. Underneath, it just said, "Thanks, Dad. Dropped 25 points at practice today." I smiled. A real, genuine smile. I texted back, "Good work, son. Come straight home." He replied a little while later, "Yes, sir. On my way now." I got in my truck, the engine rumbling to life. The cab smelled like dust and old coffee. I was tired, but it was a good tired. The kind of tired that comes from building something, not tearing it down. I thought about what his mom was making for dinner. I thought about watching the game with Caleb later. A perfect, ordinary evening. That was the last moment of peace I would know. About 20 minutes into my drive home, my phone buzzed again. It was Caleb. The text read, "Just got pulled over. I'm good." I felt a flicker of annoyance, a nod of concern. Any father in America feels it when their boy gets pulled over. But Caleb was a good driver. He didn't speed. He didn't mess around. I texted back, "What for? Be respectful. Call me when you're done." He never called. Another 10 minutes passed, then 15. The knot of concern in my gut began to tighten. I called his phone. It rang and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself he was just talking to the cop, that his phone was in the cup holder, that everything was fine. Then my phone rang. It wasn't Caleb. It was an unknown number. I pulled my truck over to the shoulder of the highway, gravel crunching under the tires. My hand was shaking as I answered. "Hello. Am I speaking with Marcus Hayes?" The voice on the other end was a woman's. She was calm, professional, too calm. "Yes, who is this?" "Mr. Hayes, my name is Linda. I'm a nurse at Mercy General Hospital. Your son Caleb, he's been brought into our emergency room." The world stopped. The cars flying past me on the highway, the birds in the trees, the sun in the sky. It all just froze. The nurse kept talking, but her words sounded like they were coming from underwater. "Mr. Hayes, are you still there? There was an incident during a traffic stop. He has sustained some injuries. He's stable for now, but the doctor would like to speak with you." An incident. That's the word she used. Not an accident. An incident. Stable for now. That's the phrase they use when the truth is too brutal to say over the phone. I've been around long enough to know the codes. These were words designed to keep me from breaking down, but all they did was shatter me into a million pieces. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember pulling back onto the highway. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and the sound of my own ragged breathing. My mind was a hurricane, replaying her words, picturing 100 different horrible scenarios. A car crash, a broken arm. Let him be okay. I made bargains with a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I promised him anything, everything, if he would just let my boy be okay. The denial was a warm blanket, but underneath it was a cold, hard dread. The dread that comes when you know, deep in your bones, that your life has just been cleaved in two. There is the before this phone call, and there is the after. And you know with absolute certainty that you can never go back. I screeched to a halt in the ambulance bay of the emergency room. I left the truck door wide open, the engine still running. I burst through the automatic doors. The ER was a controlled chaos of beeping machines, hushed conversations, and the quiet, desperate misery of people waiting for news. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. I stormed up to the front desk. A nurse looked up, startled. "My son," I gasped, my voice a raw stranger in my own throat. "Caleb Hayes, you just called me." She saw the look in my eyes. She didn't ask me to fill out a form. She didn't ask me to take a seat. She just picked up her phone and pointed down a long, sterile hallway. "This way, Mr. Hayes. Let me take you to him." In that one single phone call, the world that I had spent 20 years building for my son, a world of safety, of honest work, of peace, it was all burned to the ground. Every child deserves a father who is willing to move heaven and earth for them. But as I walked down that long, white hallway, my boots echoing on the polished floor, I didn't know then that I wouldn't just have to move heaven. I would have to walk through the deepest parts of hell to even begin to make things right. The smell of a hospital is a lie. It's meant to smell clean, sterile, a smell of antiseptic and healing. But that's not what it is. It's the smell of fear being scrubbed away. It's the smell of pain being covered up by bleach. It's the smell of bad news being delivered under the hum of fluorescent lights. I learned that as I followed the nurse down that long, white hallway. Her shoes squeaked on the polished tile, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the night. Every door we passed was a world of pain I couldn't see. Every distant beep of a machine was a heartbeat that wasn't my son's. With every step, the air got colder, heavier. She stopped in front of a bay marked with the number 4. She paused, looked at me for a second, her eyes full of a professional pity that made my skin crawl. And then she pulled back the thin blue curtain. The man in the bed, it wasn't my son. That was the first thought that went through my head, a flash of pure, irrational denial. It had to be a mistake, a horrible mix-up, because the person lying on that bed, buried under a web of white bandages and clear plastic tubes, that wasn't Caleb. Caleb was 17. He was 6'3" and still growing. He was strong, vibrant. His body was a machine built for grace and power on a basketball court. His jaw was strong, always set in a determined line when he was focused. His eyes were full of life, of dreams, of a future that was shining right in front of him. The person on this bed was a ruin, a body someone had tried to break. His head was wrapped in so much gauze it looked misshapen. A tube snaked out of his nose, taped to his cheek. Another went into his arm, dripping clear fluid into his veins. His eye sockets weren't just bruised. They were swollen into 2 dark purple slits. He looked like a stranger wearing my son's skin. And his jaw, I couldn't stop staring at his jaw. It was wired shut, a cage of medical steel and tape, sealing his mouth, sealing his voice. The same mouth that had just hours ago been laughing with his friends, that had called me dad. Now it was just a broken line and a swollen face. I walked forward. I don't think my feet were touching the ground. I felt like I was floating in a nightmare. My hand reached out and gripped the cold metal bed rail. I squeezed it so hard I felt the metal bite into my palms. I needed to feel something real, something solid, because nothing else in that room made any sense. My hands. These hands that taught him how to tie his shoes, that tossed a basketball back and forth with him for thousands of hours in our driveway. These hands that had held him as a baby, that had built the very house he grew up in. They were strong, calloused, capable hands. And in that moment, they couldn't do a damn thing. They were useless. I couldn't take his pain. I couldn't heal his wounds. I couldn't even wipe the crusted blood from his hairline. I had never felt so utterly and completely helpless in my entire life. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the stiff hospital blanket. A sound came out of my throat, a ragged whisper. "They did this to you?" There was no answer, of course. Just the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. It was the only thing in the room telling me he was still with me. That steady beep was an act of defiance, a tiny flicker of life in the face of so much destruction. I looked at his still form, and the question that had been a dull roar in the back of my mind now became a sharp, piercing scream. Who? Who did this? Who could do this to a child? A good kid. My kid. And in the sterile silence of that room, the answer came to me. It wasn't a name. It was an idea. It was a uniform, a badge, a system. The same system I had run from my whole life. The same system I had worked so hard to protect Caleb from. And in the end, it had found him anyway. Something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, a great heavy stone in my gut. But something else was starting to stir beneath it. The fog of shock and sorrow began to part, and through it came a cold, terrible clarity. It was like a switch being flipped in a dark room deep inside my soul. A room I hadn't entered in 20 years. The room where the old Marcus lived. A doctor came in, a young woman with tired eyes. She spoke to me in that same calm, professional voice. She used medical terms. Blunt force trauma, multiple fractures to the jaw, 3 broken ribs, severe concussion. I heard the words, but they meant something different to me. Blunt force trauma became the fist that struck his face. Fractured jaw became the boot that silenced his protest. Broken ribs became the coordinated kicks from men who enjoyed their work. She was describing his injuries. I was cataloging their crimes. She said they were doing everything they could. She said he was strong. She said he was a fighter. I knew that. But I also knew that some fights you can't win by yourself. I stood there for an hour, maybe 2. I didn't move. I just watched the steady rise and fall of my son's chest. I watched the numbers on the monitors. I watched the slow drip of the IV. And I made a promise, a silent vow, not to God, but to my son. I promised him that the people who did this would know his name. They would know his father's name. They would feel a fraction of the pain that was radiating from his broken body. The man who walked into that hospital room was a father, broken by grief. But the man who would eventually walk out, he was going to be something else entirely. He was going to be a debt collector, and the debt they owed my son would be paid in full. A body is not an object. It's not just flesh and bone. It carries stories. It carries scars. It carries the love of the people who brought it into this world. And as I stood there watching my son fight for his life, I knew that the story of his injuries, the story of what was done to him in the dark on that quiet road, could not and would not end in silence. Have you ever walked into a government building, like a courthouse? There's a strange kind of quiet inside them. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a heavy, sterile silence that smells like old paper, weak coffee, and indifference. It's the kind of quiet that's designed to make you feel small, to make your problems, your pain, your whole life feel like just another piece of paper in an endless stack of folders. I'd spent the last 20 years of my life avoiding places like that. I had learned the hard way that their kind of justice wasn't built for people like me. But for my son, for Caleb, I was willing to try one last time. I was willing to walk back into the heart of the machine, to look it in the eye, and to give it a chance to prove me wrong. I wanted it to prove me wrong. I prayed it would. The soulless words. I walked through the metal detector at the entrance to the Oakley County Courthouse. My boots, still carrying a faint trace of hospital disinfectant, echoed on the marble floors. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. I wasn't the man I used to be. the one who would have kicked down doors. I was a father. I was here to ask for help, not to start a war. Not yet. I found the district attorney's office on the third floor. The receptionist, a woman with tired eyes, looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat with boredom. "I'm here to see the DA," I said. "It's about my son, Caleb Hayes." Her expression didn't change. She knew the name. I could see the flicker of recognition. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "But he'll see me." I didn't wait for her to argue. I walked past her desk, down a short hallway, and stopped in front of a heavy oak door with a brass plaque that read, "Julian Croft, District Attorney." I knocked once. A sharp, hard rap. I didn't wait for an answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly what you'd expect. A big, cluttered desk stood like a fortress between him and the world. Piles of manila folders threatened to avalanche onto the floor. A laptop was open, its screen filled with text he wasn't reading. A small fan in the corner hummed, stirring the papers on his desk. It was the office of a man who was busy, but not with justice. He was busy with management. He didn't look up when I came in. He just kept scribbling something on a legal pad with a red pen. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer me a seat. After a long, heavy silence, he slid a thin file across the polished surface of his desk. He still didn't make eye contact. I didn't sit down. I stood there, my arms crossed, watching him. Inside that folder, I knew, was the official version of my son's life nearly ending. A story scrubbed clean of all its horror, all its humanity. I saw a few grainy photographs of Caleb's bruised face. I saw a picture of his torn school jacket. And I saw a few blurry screenshots from a body camera, images that cut off mid-motion, showing nothing. A note was paperclipped to the top. "No dash cam footage available. Officer body cams malfunctioned during the incident." Malfunctioned. All of them. At the same time. He was handing me a ghost story and calling it an official report. He wasn't just lying to me. He was insulting my intelligence. Finally, he spoke. His voice was as dry and brittle as old paper. "Mr. Hayes," he said, still looking down at his desk, "I've reviewed the preliminary reports from the arresting officers." He paused as if for dramatic effect. Then he delivered the lines he had clearly rehearsed. "There is not enough evidence to press charges against the officers." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Not enough evidence. My son was lying in a hospital bed, his jaw wired shut, and there wasn't enough evidence. He kept talking, his tone unchanging. "According to their statements, your son was uncooperative. He resisted arrest." Resisted. A 17-year-old boy coming home from basketball practice. What was he resisting? The right for them to break his body? "Everything they did," the DA concluded, finally glancing up at me for a fraction of a second, his eyes empty of anything resembling empathy, "was by protocol." Protocol. That word. That single soulless word. It hit me harder than a fist, as if there's a procedure for shattering a child's jaw, a checklist for leaving a boy bleeding and choking in the gravel. He was using the language of bureaucracy to sanitize an act of brutal, savage violence. He was trying to convince me that the nightmare my son was living through was just paperwork. I didn't blink. I didn't yell. I didn't curse him. In that moment, the old me, the man I had buried, was screaming inside my head, telling me to leap across that desk and show this man what real consequences felt like. But I held it back. I let the silence do the talking. The DA, uncomfortable with the quiet, started shuffling papers. "These things are difficult," he said, as if he were talking about a budget problem. "The public puts a lot of pressure on these situations. The best thing to do is to let the process work itself out." The process. There was that word again, a word used by people in power to mean wait, be quiet, and go away. I had been through their process before, a lifetime ago. I knew what it meant. It meant waiting for nothing. It meant being ground down by the gears of the machine until you were too tired to fight anymore. It meant they would wait until the world forgot about my son. He was dismissing me. He was dismissing Caleb. My son's pain, his fear, his broken body. To this man, it was just an inconvenient file on a cluttered desk that he wanted to stamp closed and put away. That was it. That was the moment the last bit of hope I had in the system died. It didn't die with a scream. It died with a quiet, cold click in my soul. The click of a door closing for the last time. I turned around without saying another word. I walked out of his office. The receptionist didn't look at me as I passed. The hallway seemed longer now, emptier. As I walked towards the exit, my footsteps echoing in the sterile silence, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The system had given me its final answer, and its answer was no. No justice here, no help here, no hope here. And by telling me no, it had untied my hands. It had released me from my promise to do things the right way. I got back to my truck and just sat there for a long time, the engine off. The world outside the windshield kept moving. Cars passed, people walked by, a siren wailed in the distance. But inside my truck, everything was still. I was in the eye of my own personal hurricane. The rage was there, a white-hot fire in my chest. But now it wasn't a wild, chaotic fire. It was focused. It was cold. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel, these calloused, scarred hands. I had dedicated them to building a better life, to honest work. But the system had made it clear that a better life wasn't for my son to have, not if it got in the way of their protocol. The law is meant to protect the innocent, not to provide excuses for the guilty. And when the law refuses to do its job, when it becomes a shield for the very monsters it's supposed to chain down, then it is no longer the law. It is just a lie, written on a piece of paper, signed by men with no souls. Have you ever had a part of yourself that you tried to kill? A piece of your own history, a person you used to be, that you decided was no good. So you took him out to the back of your mind, you put a bullet in him, and you buried him deep. You spend years, decades even, tending to his grave, making sure he stays down. You build a new life on top of that ground, a better life, and you think you're safe. You think he's gone forever, but he's not. He's just waiting for a moment of profound, unbearable pain, waiting for the one thing that can reach down into the cold earth and pull him back into the world of the living. For me, that moment happened in the cab of my truck, parked across the street from a courthouse that had just spit in the face of my son's suffering. Dusting off the boots, I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the engine off, the hum of the city, the traffic, the distant sirens, the chatter of people on the sidewalk. It was all a movie playing on the other side of a thick glass window. None of it could touch me. I was no longer in that world. I was in the quiet, echoing space of a father who had just been told his son's life didn't matter. Not enough evidence. The DA's words played on a loop in my head. Your boy resisted. It's all by protocol. Protocol. I thought about Caleb, lying in that hospital bed, his body a roadmap of their protocol. The protocol for turning a vibrant 17-year-old boy into a broken thing held together by wires and tubes. The system I had grudgingly respected, the one I had taught my son to navigate with his head held high and his hands visible, had shown its true face. It was not a shield for the innocent. It was a wall to protect its own. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, the cheap plastic groaning under the pressure. The tattoos on my knuckles, faded outlines of dice and scripture from a life I'd fought so hard to escape, seemed to darken, to come back to life. I had been good for so long. I walked the line. I got a contractor's license. I paid my taxes. I took pride in the sweat on my brow, in building things instead of breaking them. I did it all so Caleb would never have to know the man I buried. And now, because of them, my son had seen something worse than that man could have ever shown him. I reached over and opened the glove box. I rummaged past old registration papers, a tire gauge, a half-eaten roll of mints. My fingers found the edge of a false bottom I hadn't touched in 15 years. I pulled it up. There, wrapped in a dusty, oil-stained rag, was a relic from my past. It was a flip phone, square, black, beat up. It hadn't been charged in almost a decade. It shouldn't have worked. But some things, some pieces of the dark, they don't die. They just sleep. I held it in my palm, It felt heavier than my smartphone. It felt like a weapon. This small plastic box was the key to a world I had sworn off, a door I had locked and sealed. But the man who made that promise, the man who believed in building a quiet life, his voice was now just a whisper drowned out by the roar of a father's rage. I flipped it open. The snap of the hinge was a sound that echoed through my bones, a sound of old habits and forgotten violence. I pressed the power button. For a second, nothing. Then the small screen flickered to life, its pale green glow lighting up the dark cab of the truck. The old contact list was still there. Not names, just initials, street codes, numbers I had burned into my muscle memory. Rhino, Slide, Whisper, Ghosts, demons I had cast out. My demons. I didn't scroll. I knew which one to call. My thumb hovered over the button. This was the real moment of no return. Not the hospital, not the DA's office. This, the conscious choice to open the door, to invite the devil back in. Outside, a group of kids walked by, laughing, shoving each other, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. They were alive. They were free. They had futures, just like my son was supposed to. That was all it took. I pressed call. It rang once. Just once. Then a voice answered. Deep, calm, confident. No hello. No, who's this? Just a single, familiar word. Yo! I stared out through the windshield. A bird flew overhead, a black slash against the pale blue sky. My voice, when it came out, didn't crack. It was perfectly even. It was a voice I hadn't used in a long time. It's Marcus, I said. I need a favor. There was no pause on the other end. No surprise, no questions about where I'd been for the last 15 years. Just a quiet acceptance, as if he had been sitting by the phone, waiting for this call ever since the day I walked away. Where? Was all he said. Same place, I replied. A click. The call ended. I slowly closed the phone and set it in the cup holder. It was done. The fuse had been lit. The breaker in the basement of my soul, the one that had been switched off for years, had been flipped back on. The law had spoken its piece. It had said, there is no justice for you here. So now I would speak back. Not with lawsuits, not with press conferences, but with the only language men like Officer Shaw and D.A. Croft ever seemed to respect. The language of consequences. I looked at my hands again, resting on the wheel. The old scars, the faded ink. I remembered the strength in them, a strength that had once broken doors and ruled alleys. I hadn't wanted to go back to that. They hadn't given me a choice. They had brought the war to my son's hospital bed. So now, I was going to bring it back to them. I shifted the truck into gear. The engine roared to life, a sound that felt different now. It was the sound of my own rage, finally given form. I pulled away from the courthouse without a single glance in the rearview mirror. I had no reason to look back. The man who had walked in there an hour ago was gone. My new phone, the old phone, buzzed once in the cup holder. A new message. Just 2 words. Midnight. Auto shop. I smiled. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't a good smile. It was the kind of smile a man makes when he remembers exactly who he used to be and realizes that the monster he tried so hard to bury is the only thing left that can save him. The past is never truly dead. It's not even past. It's just dormant, waiting for the right kind of pain to wake it from its slumber. And I knew in that moment, with a certainty that chilled me to my very core, that to save my son's future, I would have to resurrect every single one of my own demons. Have you ever had a place you swore you'd never go back to? A place that holds the ghost of a person you no longer are. A house, a street corner, a room. You spend years driving the long way around just to avoid it. You tell yourself it's a tomb, and the person buried there is you. For me, that place was an old, abandoned auto shop on the forgotten edge of Meridian. For 15 years, it was a ghost story, I told myself. But that night, after leaving the courthouse, I wasn't running from the ghost anymore. I was driving straight toward it, because I finally understood. I didn't need to run from the man I used to be. I needed to ask him for a favor, reassembling the covenant. The night smelled like rust and old gasoline. The auto shop sat crouched under a moonless sky, half swallowed by weeds and darkness. The old sign above the bay door was still there, faded and peeling. Manny's tires. Manny had been dead for 7 years. It didn't matter. Tonight, this tomb was about to be resurrected. It was going to be our headquarters. I rolled my truck across the cracked asphalt, killing the engine and the headlights, letting the darkness swallow me whole. I stepped out. The steel-toed boots I had dug out of the back of my closet felt heavy on my feet. Familiar. The ground crunched under them like it remembered me. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of dead engines and spilled oil. The old hydraulic lift stood in the center of the room, like a metal skeleton, creaking softly whenever the wind blew through the broken windows. Rusted tools lined the shelves like tired, forgotten bones. I stood in the middle of it all, a silhouette in the gloom, and I waited. I didn't pace. I didn't check the time. I just waited. I knew they would come, and they did. One by one, they slipped out of the darkness. No headlights, no loud engines. They moved like the men I remembered. The first to arrive was Rhino. He was taller, broader than I remembered, his hair in thick locks now, but he still had the same easy swagger. He used to be our muscle, the quiet one whose presence was louder than any threat. Now he ran a legitimate security firm for local concerts. He still looked like he could stop a riot with a single stare. Next came Slide. His real name was Damon, but we called him Slide because of how smoothly he could move a car through impossible situations. He ran a tow truck company now, out on the interstate. He wore a clean mechanic's shirt with a gold chain tucked underneath, but he still had the eyes of a man who sees every angle, every exit, in every room he enters. The last to arrive was Whisper. Nobody knew his real name, not even me. He didn't text, he didn't call, he just appeared when he was needed. He was thin, almost invisible in the darkness, but he was the most dangerous of us all. He saw things, he heard things. He was the one who knew the secrets the city tried to keep. They entered without knocking, without a sound. Their boots echoed on the concrete floor like the slow, deliberate beat of a war drum. They formed a half circle around me. Rhino, Slide, Whisper, my brothers. Not by blood, but by something deeper. Something forged in the dark alleys and back rooms of a life I had left behind. No one asked why I had called. No one asked where I had been for 15 years. They already knew. They could see it in my eyes. They had heard the whispers on the street about my son. Slide was the first to speak. He cracked a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. Never thought I'd see you dust off these old boots again, Mark. I didn't smile back. My time for smiling was over. I just looked at each of them, these men who had followed me through hell before. We got work, I said. That's all it took. 2 words. No need for long speeches. No need for drawn-out explanations about justice or revenge. These were men who had built their lives on a foundation of silence and brutal efficiency. They didn't need a motive. They just needed a target. I walked over to a dusty workbench near the back wall. I set down the thin file I'd carried from my truck. Inside were the photographs. 3 officers, Shaw, Finch, and the other one. Their faces, their badge numbers, their home addresses, their daily routines. I laid them out on the table, face up under the single buzzing fluorescent light. I arranged them like cards in a game I had no intention of losing. These are the ones, I said, my voice low and even. The others gathered around the table. 4 heads bowed together in the dim light, 4 shadows merging into one. One by one, they scanned the images. Cops with clean records and dirty hands. Men who had walked away from my son's broken body like he was just a piece of trash on the side of the road. Men who were protected by a system, shielded by a badge. Slide tapped one of the photos. It was the backyard of a suburban house. A child's swing set was visible in the background. Family, he said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. All of them got someone. Rhino leaned on the table, his heavy arms crossed. What's the play, Mark? I looked up from the photos, my eyes meeting his. Steady, unblinking. First we watch. We learn. Then we make them feel it. We make them feel what it's like to be helpless, to be hunted. Rhino cracked his knuckles, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the quiet shop. How far are we taking this? That was the real question, the final seal on our old covenant. He wasn't asking if we were breaking the law. We had all lived our lives on the other side of that line. He was asking if I was ready to go all the way, if I was ready to become the man I used to be, the man they had once followed without question. I didn't answer him right away. I turned and walked to an old rusted locker in the corner, a locker that hadn't seen the light of day in years. I snapped the old padlock with a pair of bolt cutters. The door creaked open. Inside was our old life, waiting for us. Black hoodies, burner phones, gloves, and a toolbox filled with items that had no legitimate purpose. I grabbed what we needed, carried it back to the workbench, and set it down with a heavy thud. Then I turned back to them, my face set like stone. As far as it takes, I said, and that was the real beginning. Not the hospital, not the DA's office, not the phone call. This moment, this room, this crew. This was the birth of something the city wasn't ready for. A storm with no name, no badge, and no jurisdiction. Just four men with a history, bound by loyalty, and now united by a single mission. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose sheet metal on the roof. But inside the shop, the four of us stood like pillars, scarred, older, but not softer. And we were just getting started. A promise made in the dark is always kept with the strongest actions. And I knew that the bonds we had forged in the hardest of times years ago were about to be tested once more. But our war wouldn't begin with a bang. It would begin with patience. It would begin with watching. The first rule of a real war is that it's never fought with hot-blooded rage. Rage is for amateurs. It makes you sloppy. It makes you loud. It gets you caught. No, a real war is fought with something much colder. Patience. The patience of a spider in its web. The patience of a hunter on a long stalk. The patience of a father who has nothing left in the world but time and a promise he made to his son in the sterile quiet of a hospital room. Our war didn't begin with a bang. It began with a whisper. It began with watching. The price of indifference. For 7 nights, my crew and I became ghosts. We dissolved into the background of the city. We were the forgettable face in the coffee shop, the nondescript car 2 lanes over, the shadow in a dimly lit alley. We didn't follow the cops. We studied them. We learned them. We deconstructed their comfortable, predictable lives piece by piece. Slide, with his tow truck company, had a dozen different vehicles at his disposal. He could tail a man for hours, swapping cars 3 times and never be noticed. He mapped their routes, their stops, their moments of distraction. Whisper. He did what he always did. He listened. He slipped into bars where the cops drank after their shifts. He made friends with dispatchers and court clerks. He gathered the small, quiet secrets that people leave behind like breadcrumbs. And Rhino, he did the physical work. He mapped their homes. He documented their alarm systems, their blind spots, the neighbor's dog that barked at everything, the overgrown hedge that provided perfect cover. And me? I just watched. My target was Officer Shaw, the man who started it all, the one who barked the orders, who yanked Caleb from the car. I sat in my truck for hours, parked down the street from his neat suburban house. I watched him leave for his shift at 6:15 a.m. sharp. I watched him come home at 5:42 p.m. I watched him kiss his wife on the porch and wave to his neighbor. He looked so ordinary, a monster hiding in plain sight. One evening, I watched as he helped his own daughter, a little girl no older than my own, off the school bus. He knelt down, fixed the strap on her backpack, and they laughed about something. A part of me, the father in me, felt a flicker of something. But the other part, the part that was now in control, crushed it. My war was not with his children. It was not with his wife. My war was with the man who went home to his family after leaving my son to die in a ditch. And I made a silent vow right there. No kids, no women, no one who wasn't on the list. I wasn't them. I would not become them. After 7 nights, we had what we needed, the rhythm of their lives. And we knew, to make them listen, we first had to break that rhythm. We had to destroy their peace. The first strike came at 3:04 a.m. on a Tuesday. We chose one of the other officers, a man named Dunlap. His prized possession was a brand new pickup truck. Rhino planted a small, precisely measured incendiary device under the engine block. It wasn't a bomb meant to kill. It was a statement meant to be heard for miles. The explosion lit up his quiet, perfect cul-de-sac like a battlefield. We weren't there to see it, but we watched it on the news later. The flames dancing on the siding of his house, the fear on his face as he stood on his lawn in his pajamas. And on the sidewalk, spray-painted in dripping red letters, was our first official communication. My son's blood costs more than your badge. Fear is a seed, and we had just planted it. The department went on high alert. They checked under their cars. They looked over their shoulders, but they didn't know what they were looking for. So we sent them another message. This time, it was quieter, more personal. We sent boxes, 3 boxes, to 3 officers' homes, delivered before dawn. Inside, there were no explosives. There was something worse. There were pieces of their own lives, twisted and violated. One of them opened his box to find his badge, snapped in 2. Another found family photos, taken from a distance, with a single bloody red handprint smeared across the faces of his children. Shaw's wife opened his. Inside was a child's drawing from their own refrigerator, vandalized, and a single heavy-duty zip tie, soaked in what looked and smelled like blood. There were no notes. They weren't needed. The message was clear. We were in your lives. We were in your homes. The walls you built cannot protect you. You are not safe. The precinct became a fortress, but it didn't matter. The fear was already inside. And that's what I was waiting for. Because fear makes men break routine. And broken routines lead to mistakes. The mistake came on a Thursday night. The other 2 officers from the traffic stop, Sanders and Dunlap, met at a dim, quiet dive bar out on a rural road. They were trying to find comfort in their old habits, but they were spooked. They drank too fast. They didn't notice the bartender watching them a little too closely. They didn't notice Whisper by the payphone, flipping it open to say one word, go. When they walked out into the parking lot just after midnight, we were waiting. The lights went out. The vans moved in. It was over in 30 seconds. No struggle, no witnesses. 2 empty trucks left behind in a dark parking lot. The police who usually investigated the crimes were now the victims of one, and no one was coming to save them. The warehouse was cold. 2 metal chairs were bolted to the concrete floor. Sanders and Dunlap were tied to them, hoods over their heads. When we pulled the hoods off, their eyes were wild with terror. I stepped out of the shadows. I didn't wear a mask. I wanted them to see my face. Dunlap started stammering. We didn't mean for... I slammed my hand on a metal table between them. The tools I had laid out rattled. Didn't mean... My voice was quiet, but it hit them like a thunderclap. You didn't mean to beat a child until his ribs broke? You didn't mean to leave him choking on his own blood in the gravel? They had no answers. Because there were no answers. I walked over to the table and picked up a heavy aluminum bat. I didn't raise it. I just felt the weight of it in my hands. I went to the system for justice, I said, pacing in front of them. I sat across from your DA. They told me it was protocol. I stopped and looked Sanders dead in the eyes. They said my son resisted. I turned to Dunlap. They said there wasn't enough proof. I put the bat down. I picked up a blowtorch. I didn't light it. I just let them look at it. I let their imaginations do the work. Because this moment wasn't about inflicting pain. It was about teaching a lesson. It was about fear. The same suffocating, helpless fear they had forced upon my son. Sanders broke first, sobbing uncontrollably. Then Dunlap, shaking so hard his chair scraped against the floor. I leaned in close, my voice a whisper. You made my son feel helpless, I said. I stood up straight. Now you get to feel it too. And then I turned and walked away, and the lights went out. The next morning the world saw our work. They were found in the woods just outside the county line. Their badges, ripped from their uniforms, had been hammered into 2 trees above their heads. And carved into the bark of the trees, for all the world to see, were the words, he couldn't breathe. Now you don't. The last one was Shaw, the one who started it all. He tried to run. He packed a bag, left his family and just drove. But you can't run from a ghost. We intercepted him on a lonely stretch of highway. No explosions, no drama, just a quiet end. I crouched down by his face as he lay on the pavement, his tough guy facade shattered. "He was just a boy," I said. "He was your traffic stop." I paused, letting him see the cold, final truth in my eyes. "Now this is mine. Each action has an equal and opposite reaction. Some people call it revenge. I call it physics. I call it balancing the scales. When you take away the safety of a man's child, you forfeit the right to your own." And I knew as we drove away from that final scene, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind us, that the work wasn't truly done. The soldiers had been dealt with, but the kings who gave the orders, the system that signed the papers, they were still out there. There's a quiet that comes after a storm. It's not peace. It's something heavier. It's the silence of exhaustion, the silence of a world that's been broken and is now trying to remember its own shape. The headlines about the precinct war, as they called it, eventually faded. The helicopters stopped circling. The barricades around the 12th precinct came down, one by one. The city of Meridian tried to go back to normal, but it couldn't. Not really. I had taught it something. I had taught it that some debts don't get erased by paperwork. I had taught a system that believed it was untouchable, that it could in fact bleed. My war was over. The names on my list were gone. But the real reason for the war, the reason for all of it, was about to come home. And I was about to find out what my victory had really cost me. The echo in the silence. It was a soft afternoon in early spring, the kind of day where the sun filters through the trees, slow and golden. I was sitting on my front porch, same place I always sat now. I wasn't working. I couldn't go back to that life. My life now was this: watching, waiting. A medical transport van, white and sterile, rolled up to the curb. My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, started to beat again, a hard, painful rhythm against my ribs. The side door slid open. A nurse stepped out, and then she lowered the wheelchair lift. And there he was, my son, Caleb. He looked smaller, thinner. The confident swagger of a 17-year-old athlete was gone, replaced by a careful stillness. His jaw was no longer wired, but a thin, pale scar traced a line along his chin. His eyes, the same eyes that used to be so full of fire and laughter, were heavy with things a boy his age should never have to know. One of his arms was still in a sling, strapped tight against his chest. He wore clean bandages, but they couldn't hide the geography of his pain. He was breathing on his own. He was alive. He was home. The nurse wheeled him up the ramp I'd built onto the porch. She gave me a quiet, knowing nod, and then she backed away, leaving us alone. She understood. This was a moment that didn't need words. My crew was there. They leaned against the porch rail, not as a gang, but as guardians. Rhino, Slide, Whisper. They didn't speak. They just stood, a silent wall of loyalty around me and my boy. They were a part of this new world I had built. Caleb looked up at me. He couldn't smile. Not really. Not yet. He couldn't speak much above a whisper. But he didn't need to. I saw it all in his eyes. There was relief. There was pain. And there was a quiet, profound understanding that scared me more than anything else. He knew what I had done. He knew the price that had been paid for his return. I had a rifle lying across my lap, an old hunting rifle. I wasn't holding it in a threatening way. It was just there, present, obvious, a symbol of the man I now had to be, a permanent statement that this family was no longer under the protection of the law. It was under my protection. And my protection had a different set of rules. The nurse had said he was healing, and he was. But I knew that some wounds don't show up on an X-ray. He was a survivor, but he would forever be marked by what they did to him on that dark road. And I would forever be marked by what I did to them in the shadows. We were two halves of the same broken story. He shifted in his chair. Slowly, with his good hand, he reached out. He didn't touch my hand. He just tapped the side of my steel-toed boot. Once, twice. It was a weak gesture, but it was as loud as a scream. It was his way of saying it. "Thank you. I'm home." I understand. I reached out and laid my hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm, steady. That was my answer. I'm here, son. I'll always be here. That was enough. Behind us, the screen door creaked open. Slide came out with 2 cold bottles of water, setting one down on the small table next to Caleb. No one said a word, but we all knew. This wasn't over. The world would keep turning. The system would patch its wounds, lick its pride, and maybe one day it would come looking for answers. But we were ready. We were no longer fighting for revenge. We were fighting for the next sunrise, for the quiet peace of a golden afternoon on a porch. I did it all for him. I tore down their world piece by piece to protect his. But as I sat there, my hand on my son's shoulder, a terrible truth settled in my soul. The violence you use to protect someone you love, it never really goes away. It doesn't wash off. It clings to you like the smell of gasoline and rust from that old auto shop. It becomes a shadow that follows you everywhere. A shadow that your own child can see in your eyes, even when you're smiling. I had won the war, but I had brought the battlefield home with me. The truest kind of justice isn't about balancing the scales of the past. It's about ensuring the future. And as I looked at my son, scarred but alive, I had to wonder if the monster I became to save him would be the thing that frightened him the most in the quiet years to come. That is the price. That is the echo that will live in our silence forever. I ask you, after hearing my story, what is the true measure of a father's love? Is it the safe and honest world you build for your child? Or is it the monsters you are willing to become to keep that world from being taken away from them? If my story, if my son's story means anything, then share it. Let it be a warning. Let it be a conversation. Let it be a reminder that there are consequences for looking away, for saying it's just protocol. So now, after everything you've heard, I leave the final verdict in your hands. Was I a father who did what he had to do, or did I become something else entirely? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if you have listened this far, if you have walked with me through this fire, maybe you can like this video and subscribe to this channel. There are more shadows in this world, and so many more files that need to be opened. Thank you for being my witness.